What I am going to talk about is this aging gracefully, scientific approaches to enhancing longevity. Now, aging gracefully from this photo, the guy on the left there, John Turner, it's probably obvious how he's aging gracefully. The one on the right, Fufi Harlan, it's probably obvious how she's aging gracefully. The one in the middle might need some explanation. That's Dara Torres. And Dara Torres won 3 silver medals in the 2008 Olympics. It turned out that was her 5th Olympics. And one of her silver medals was her finishing a 100th of a second behind the winner, and she was 41 years old at the time. And she was older than her oldest teammate by 15 years. So that's one of these remarkable stories that if you're in this field, you come across occasionally. You know, the 100-year-old that set a marathon record, the 80-year-old that climbed Mount Everest. There's actually an 85-year-old who vowed to break the record of the 80-year-old for climbing Mount Everest or die trying, and he did the latter, unfortunately. So I'd like to start off by asking you to think of a question. So here we are in the 21st century, living longer than anybody has in the 300,000-year history of our species. So what health threats are we really facing? Are we really facing things that are new? And so I'd like to, first of all, point out a few things that aren't the number one threat. It's not heart disease. More people die of heart disease than die of any other disease in the developed world, at least. But that's not the number one threat. It's not cancer. That's number 2 in the number of people that actually die for it in the developed world. Alzheimer's disease, for all the tragic consequences of it, are not really the number one health threat. The number one health threat is aging. And I'll explain to you why I say that in the next slide. So the reason I say that is, let's take heart disease, for instance. Here are 4 things that elevate your risk of dying of heart disease. And I've calculated how much they increase your risk of dying of heart disease. So hypertension, smoking, cholesterol, diabetes. Now let me take those 4 risk factors and compare them to the impact of aging. They almost disappear. So that's because aging underlies heart disease. And I could do this with really many other diseases. Let's just take one other, Alzheimer's disease. One of these risk factors is actually genetic, the one that says ApoE. That's if you have a certain variant of the ApoE gene, it increases your probability of getting Alzheimer's disease by about 5-fold. But the others, for the students in here, the thing that says sex, it doesn't mean that sex increases your chances of getting heart disease or getting Alzheimer's disease. What it means is that one of the 2 human sexes is more prone to heart disease, to Alzheimer's disease. Every other top cause of death, women are protected. They're less prone to it, but Alzheimer's disease is the one that they really suffer more from than men do. Now, let's put all of those risk factors, even the really big one of ApoE, and relate it to aging. You can see again, they all disappear into the axis. The implications, and this is true for any of the diseases that occupy the top 10 causes of death, with the exception of accidents. So aging is really causing a lot of death. It's also causing a lot of degradation in our quality of life. And I like to just show how many numbers of people are undergoing cataract removal surgery, hip and knee replacement, almost 1.5 million people now get that each year. Why do people get it? Because they're in insufferable pain. You know, it's really degrading. And then various cardiac diseases, cardiac therapies are also dealing with really crippling level of diseases. So aging is the number one threat to human health It's killing more people, degrading the quality of life of more people than anything. All of this points to, why don't we do something about it? Can we do something about it? Or is it fixed in our genes and there's really nothing that we can do? And so I think the imperative is that if we don't do anything about it, if we continue doing what we're doing now, what we're going to end up with is more dementia, depression, frailty, osteoporosis, all the things that you can read there, chronic pain, hearing loss, and not trivially, massive increases in healthcare costs. I think we all saw during the COVID-19 epidemic how little it takes to overwhelm our healthcare system. So the question that I'm investigating, and I'm going to just give you some broad strokes about it, is, can anything be done about it? And I think something can, and I put my money where my mouth is. So in 2001, New York Times published this article that the headline was, "Scientists Make Huge Wager." And I was one of the scientists. And so what I had said mistakenly with the New York Times reporter in the audience is, I think the first person to live to 150 years old is already alive. Now, a friend of mine, demographer Geroscience, read that and said, Austad has lost his mind. You know, with friends like that, who needs enemies, right? But what he suggested is that we make a wager on it. And the wager went something like this. We would each put $150 into an investment account. That money would sit there and grow until the year 2150, at which point we calculated that the historical growth rate of the stock market would be worth $500 million. Now, Jay has taken that money and invested it himself, and it's actually doing quite a bit better than the historical rate of the stock market. He had in Tesla for a long time. He took it out of Tesla. I don't know what he's doing with it now. The nature of the bet is, if in the year 2150 or before, if a single person has lived to be 150 years old and is cognitively healthy enough to carry on a conversation, then in the best case, I get all the money. In the more likely case, my daughters or their kids get all the accumulated money. Now, if not, then his descendants would get all the money. Now, in 2016, a journalist doing a story on it said, $500 million is just chicken feed. Why don't you double the bet and make it a cool $1 billion bet? And so we did. And we each put another $150 into this account, and now we can say we have a $1 billion bet on this, and we continue to get mileage out of this. We just did a podcast with Carl Zimmer, the science reporter for the New York Times. It's going to come out sometime, I think, in the spring. So why do I think that? I mean, you know, one of the things about the reporters, they say, look, when you made the bet, the oldest person ever lived was 122 years, 165 days old. And now, 23 years later, the oldest person ever is still 122 years and 165 days. Doesn't that give you pause? And I said, no, it doesn't. And so I'm going to tell you why now. Why I'm so confident. So this is the historic rate of growth in life expectancy up to the year 2010. And over that time period, life expectancy increased by about 30 years. That's absolutely remarkable. For the previous thousands and thousands of years that our species existed, life expectancy was around 30 to 40 years, and suddenly we had this huge. Now, if you continue that trend, then I'm going to win my bet. Now, by the way, this translates into an increase of 6.5 hours a day. So if you make it through today, you can expect to live another 6.5 hours longer than if you didn't make it through today. Now, some people have interpreted this pattern as life expectancy is infinite, that all we need to do is wait long enough, and I call it the fantasy. the fantasy of immortality. And you hear more and more and more about it today. There's this crazy guy, Brian Johnson, I don't know if any of you know who that is, guy who's spending $2 million a year because he says he's never going to die. So I guarantee you if I win the bet, it's not going to be because of Brian Johnson. I had lunch with him, and well, I could tell you about that another time. So this is the fantasy, is that increase in life expectancy will simply continue. The reality looks a little bit different. Since 2010 in the US, there's been virtually no increase, and then we had COVID, and you're seeing the drop off there from COVID. We've recovered pretty much all of the COVID drop off in life expectancy now. The data, the 22 data is about half recovered. The 23 data is about 3/4 recovered, and 24 data isn't out yet. So given this, why am I still so confident? Well, it's not because of the remarkable medical progress that we've made in the 21st century. This is showing the decrease in the death rate from these various degrees from the year 2000 to today. And this is adjusted for age. So we've taken age out of the equation. And what you can see from that is that stroke and heart disease deaths have dropped by over 30%. With strokes, it's almost 40%. That seems to be very, very good news. The thing is, all of that has translated into only a 2-year increase in life expectancy. And basically, that's because of what demographers call competing risks, which the easy way to say it is if heart disease and stroke doesn't get you, something will. Some other things pop up. It's like whack-a-mole. You do better with heart disease and then suddenly Alzheimer's disease, because the other part of that is thanks to all of that medical progress, which has been wonderful, and we're living healthier longer than ever before now, there have been some consequences. One of the consequences is a tremendous increase in Alzheimer's disease, tremendous increase in the number of people who are now living in nursing homes. So none of that is really why I'm so confident. And it's also not because of the way we did what I now call 20th century medicine, and this is my view of it. We have cardiologists, we have oncologists, we have neurologists, and the National Institutes of Health, if you look at their institutes, they're sort of organized the same way, by disease or by organ. And we're getting very, very good at diagnosing and treating these things after they developed. But what we haven't done is we haven't brought all of this together as I think 21st century medicine will, because the underlying processes, it turns out, are all related to one another. And so what we really need is we need to target the basic biology of aging, which just unlike fixing one thing and allowing other things to increase, would target all of these things at the same time. Now the question becomes, well, that sounds like a great idea. And the other thing by doing this is that we can talk about prevention. Don't wait till you get signs and symptoms of a disease and then see if we can make those better, but prevent those things from the first. Now, can they do it? So I'm going to tell you 6 things that are in the pipeline that look really, really promising for actually targeting the biology of aging to keep us healthy longer. Of course, if we stay healthy longer, we'll also live longer, and that's why I'm going to win my bet. So let me just go through a few of those. One thing that happened during the COVID-19 pandemic is that we developed vaccines remarkably fast, and they were a new kind of vaccine. They were these things called mRNA vaccines that targeted these proteins, these spike proteins on the virus. But those aren't the only things that those kinds of vaccines could potentially target. There are cells in your body that were called senescent cells, that basically cells that get old and start misbehaving, that we know are involved in a lot of diseases. There's now in production vaccines against those senescent cells to keep those senescent cells. There are vaccines against Alzheimer's disease in research as well. We're also getting better at figuring out how to use viruses to deliver therapies to specific places that we want to, specific cell types in the body. And again, this is all stuff that's in development right now. Some of the ones I'm going to talk about are in human trials already. So that's one thing, these new sorts of vaccines against things we never thought we'd have vaccines against, like vaccines against cancer that we now have. We now have the HPV vaccine, for instance. The second sort of advance that I'd like to talk about has to do with testing molecules, drugs, or medications that seem to combat aging. And I want to introduce this program that's supported by the National Institute on Aging because it's the most rigorous drug testing program I know about. And the idea is called the Interventions Testing Program. And the important thing about it is they do exactly the same test at 3 different places at the same time. Now in science, we don't believe anything unless somebody can replicate it. Preferably somebody that really hates your guts so that has lots of motivation not to replicate it but could do it anyway. So the ITP has tested a variety of drugs in mice. Any drug that you can put in food or water, they will test. And they've come up with some remarkable successes. The one that I'm going to focus on is a drug called Rapamycin, which is currently used in the clinic. It's used in some chemotherapy cocktails. It's embedded in cardiac stents to prevent overgrowth. It's used in an immunosuppressive cocktail for mostly kidney transplants. But in 2009, a paper was published showing rapamycin to be the first molecule that if you gave it to mice, made them live longer in all 3 of these cases. And the thing about this study that made it unique was not only was it replicated 3 times, but they didn't start it till the mice were the equivalent of about 60 years old in human terms. Now, that was an accident. Like a lot of scientific advances, sometimes accidents are good. The accident in this case is they couldn't get the rapamycin to stay stable in the food. It would tend to degrade when they put it into food. And while they were figuring out how to deal with that, they'd set aside all these mice for the experiment. And while they're figuring it out, the mice are getting older and older and older. By the time they figured it out, the mice were the equivalent of 60 years old. So they had a decision to make. Do we go ahead and do this experiment with our 60-year-old mice now, or do we throw them away and start again with mice that are the equivalent of about 30, which is what they were originally wanted to do? If they had asked me, I would have said, throw those out, start with the young ones. Fortunately, they didn't ask me. And so they went ahead and they did it with 60-year-old mice. And it made them live longer. It made them live about 30 to 40% longer. It was actually 30% males, 40% in females from the time they started getting the drug. Some other people tried it even later in mice, at the mouse equivalent of 70 to 75 years. It still made them live longer. And the cool thing about this is not just that it made the mice live longer, is that it seemed to have such broad effects that it was hard to argue that it wasn't really targeting the fundamental biology of aging. And so I'll just tell you some of the other things. So it turns out this same drug completely prevents some kinds of mouse cancers or delays the onset and slows the progression. You can genetically engineer mice to get a form of atherosclerosis, and even normal mice get some later heart problems. And this develops the development of atherosclerosis, and it prevents the heart problems. It rejuvenates your stem cells, the cells that make all the blood in your body. It rejuvenated those so that those were actually acting like young cells. It delayed and slowed mouse versions of Alzheimer's disease, and there's now 2 Alzheimer's trials going on that I know of with rapamycin. Not to mention it's now in the veterinary literature for treating cat cardiac problems. It even, of all things, slows the progression of periodontal disease. in mice. And then the last thing that I'll mention, because this is the thing that really surprised me, is that it enhances and it broadens vaccine protection. So every year when there's a public service announcement in the fall for us all to get our flu vaccine, one of the things they don't tell you is that the older you are, the less likely you are to be protected from the flu by the vaccine. That's because you need a vigorous immune response. And one of the things that happens with aging is our immune system ages as well. So basically, if you're over 65, you get a version of the flu vaccine that's got twice as much of the vaccine. Well, it turns out if you give mice rapamycin and then give them a flu vaccine and then expose them to the flu, the old mice behave just like young mice. Old mice that don't get rapamycin first all die from the doses that they give them, whereas the rapamycin mice survive. Now, immune systems are tricky. You know, when I'm teaching, you know, and I'm looking at textbooks for teaching, first thing I look at is the description of the immune system. So it's so complicated. I thought, well, if they can explain the immune system, they can explain anything in this textbook. So I thought, well, this is something that you'd never expect to really hold for humans. But in fact, there was then a human trial. It was done in Australia. They did exactly the same thing. A bunch of people over 65. Part of them got rapamycin for several weeks and then got a rest, and several of them got a placebo for several weeks and then got a rest. And then they got a flu vaccine. They didn't then give them purposely the flu and see how many died, but what they did is they measured the antibody response and found out that not only was there a boost in the antibody response, but there was a boost in antibodies that were protective against strains of flu that were not even in the vaccine, that were related flu. So this really looks like this one drug in mice. Now let me, except for the last one, these are all mice. It looks like, and there are tons more of these. So it looks like in theory and in practice in mice, it really is possible to target pharmacologically the biology of aging and prevent lots of things from going on at the same time. I did some of these studies, and one of them we found it even protected against late life depression, but it only did that in male mice for some reason. It turns out that the intervention testing program has gone on and tested a whole bunch of drugs, over 60 drugs now, and I've just shown you some of the hits. The ones on the left there are the ones that extended mouse life, and the percentages that I've got next to them are showing you how much did it extend that life for. And you can see that 7 of them extended life by more than 10% of the mice. So if this were humans, this would mean instead of life expectancy being 80 approximately, it would be roughly 88. So pretty substantial increase. Now here's the shocking thing about this, and nobody expected this, is a lot of those drugs only work in one sex. They only work in males, most of them. And that was a shock. Nobody expected that. And if this is true in humans, this changes everything. It means that we're likely to have a pharmacology that's female-specific and male-specific. The two at the bottom there actually are the only two which made male mice live longer but made female mice live shorter. So we have to understand that. And this was going to be part of my talk when I talked about why women live longer than men. And you can ask me about that. But again, nobody expected this. There's another thing, besides these new drugs, there's the repurposing of old drugs. And there's a metformin trial. Now, whenever I mention this, I get a smile of satisfaction from some people in the audience who happen to be taking metformin because it's the most common drug taken for type 2 diabetes. It turns out, though, that it has, in terms of the observational epidemiology, compare people that are taking metformin with people that you try to match that are not taking it, it turns out that it looks like it's protective against cancer, dementia, and cardiac disease. But what we need is a clean, what's called clinical trial, where people are randomly assigned. And so there was this one trial that found that older people who were diabetic and taking metformin for their diabetes actually live better than people that were matched for all kinds of things that were the same age. So the metformin trial is a trial that was come up with by a small group of us about 8 years ago. This is the first one we want to test in humans. We want to test it in humans because it's been around for 60 years. It's very safe. It's very cheap. We went to the FDA to try to get them to tell us whether they would approve it. And one of the things they liked was that it was very cheap, which meant that it basically would be available to everyone, but it also meant that we didn't go to the FDA because we were trying to make a quick buck on doing this. It's had a very difficult time getting funded because nobody's going to get rich off of this. It looks like the funding is coming around now. There's a small part of it that's just getting underway, and I'll tell you in a little while about who's helping fund that. Here's the other thing, and this is one of my favorite stories because it's so true, and it means that some of our folk mythology has something in it. So what was done about 15 years ago now, been done for 150 years, you take 2 mice and you basically make a small incision in their skin and you sew them together, and their vessels will merge. So they'll end up sharing a blood supply. And what was done about 15 years ago, someone said, well, what would happen if we took a young mouse and an old mouse? And we did that to them. And when they did that, it turned out that the old mouse had this incredible regeneration of its brain, of its muscles, of its heart, of pretty much everything that you could imagine. And this has been done, again, in multiple labs by multiple people. So again, of course, the race was on. Well, what is it in this young blood that seems to miraculously rejuvenate the old mouse? One of the things they didn't emphasize is what happened to the young mouse. Yeah, the young mouse went through this period of accelerated aging. So there was a brief flurry of discovery. A group from Harvard published, we know what the molecule is. It's this molecule called GDF11. And they published it, and it got lots of publicity, and they started their own startup companies, but it turned out nobody could repeat it. So it kind of went away. But what they now have done is they now have sort of separated the blood proteins. This, by the way, even worked with human umbilical cord blood given to old mice. But these are mice that had their immune system destroyed. So now what they're saying is that we know the fraction of the protein. It may not be one thing. It may be a combination of things. But there are now at least 9 clinical trials. I don't think it will be too long before when you get a blood transfusion, it will have the age of the donor on it. And I've been trying to convince my students that there's a business opportunity here. People were paying not long ago $10,000 for transfusion for the blood of people under 25. So there's a company called Alkahest that's got a bunch of these human trials that are in early stages, but have completed some of those. So that's another, the blood. And then there are another class of drugs called senolytic drugs. And remember I said there are these cells that misbehave when you get older called senescent cells. One of the things they do is if they were cells that replicated a lot, like your immune cells, they don't replicate anymore. The other thing they do is they start to ooze out all of these chemicals that are really damaging to it. Well, we've now identified a number of chemicals, some of which are over-the-counter supplements that seem to preferentially kill those cells. And when they do that, the mice stay healthy longer and they live longer. And there's a number of companies that have already started. There's 2 drugs they call it D plus Q, dasatinib plus quercetin, and then there's a supplement. So again, there are at least a dozen other chemicals that are now being tested for their senolytic properties. One of the most interesting ones that we don't know enough about yet is this, the celebrity drug, right, for weight loss. It's originally developed, by the way, I have to say, it was developed based on some proteins in the venom of Gila monsters, which is why this was here. But semaglutide not only prevents type 2 diabetes and has remarkable effects on weight loss, but it also seems to be protective against a lot of other things. Cardiovascular disease seems to have anti-inflammatory processes. Again, it's early days, but now people are testing it for pretty much everything. And the last one I'll talk about now is what are called partial reprogramming strategies. This is the hardest one to explain to a lay audience, but let me try. So 2006 Nobel Prize was given to this man here, Shinya Yamanaka. And what he did is he succeeded in finding a way to take any cell in your body, a skin cell, a blood cell, a lung cell, and turn it back into an embryonic stem cell. Embryonic stem cells are the cells that make all of the tissues of your body as you develop from an embryo to an adult. So that's essentially taking it, and it doesn't seem to matter. They've created these cells called induced pluripotent stem cells from people that are 100 years old and turned them back into embryonic stem cells. If you think about it, it's like turning the clock back to zero, resetting it to zero. Well, not long ago, some people say, well, what if we, and the way they do this is they give this a cocktail of proteins or mRNAs. And so what if we gave what if we gave them a low dose of this? So we sort of partially do it. Because if you take them all the way back to stem cells, they could turn out to be cancer cells. Cancer cells develop quite nicely from stem cells. They did it, and they had remarkable successes. The first success was from lab of David Sinclair, and what they used it to restore vision in one eye that they'd purposely sliced the optic nerve of. They basically used these to regrow the optic nerve. Subsequently, people have done it and actually looked at how long the animals lived, how healthy they stayed, and they had remarkable results. So right now, from the things that I've sold you, some other things I don't have time to go into today, Geroscience. Now, I haven't explained what that means. That's basically a view of health and diseases from the standpoint of fundamental aging processes. So those of us who are studying those processes are geroscientists. We're not working on specific diseases, we're working on addressing multiple diseases at the same time. And I have been in the field for 35 years, and there's never been a time when there's been as much excitement as there is now. And the reason for that excitement is interesting. First of all, there are real advances that I've just told you about, and those things now are quickly moving into human trials. So we're going to know in a few years how many of these things don't just work in mice, but also work in people. And that promises to have to change everything. Money, because of this progress, and also because a lot of billionaires are getting older, and they don't want to continue to get older, money is absolutely pouring into the field. These are the top 15 companies that are investing in geroscience now. And some of them, number one there, Altos Lab, that's actually Jeff Bezos' investment. They're actually stealing a bunch of talented researchers from academics by paying them $1 million a year. So unfortunately, he hasn't come to ask me about that yet, but a lot of my friends now work for Altos. Calico is an offshoot of Google. So serious money is going into this. And in addition to these up here, I've put these in the bottom. One is called Hevolution. Hevolution is a private philanthropic organization in the US that is putting $1 billion a year into geroscience until at least 2030. So major contributor. The National Institute on Aging's budget has tripled in the last 5 years. And then there are lots of people, some of whose names would be familiar if I mentioned to them, who are smaller investors. They're only worth $1 billion or $2 billion, but they're starting to put millions of dollars into this. So that I think just indicates the level of interest in this. And now there are all the things I mentioned they're moving directly into human trials, and that's new. Before, we never moved things so quickly into human trials, but now, because the globe is an older place than it ever has been, this is becoming tricky. And then I have to talk about this. This is one more recent and interesting development. You guys aren't far from St. Louis here, so you should recognize Charles Lindbergh there. And I don't know how many of you know, but Charles Lindbergh, of course, who got famous for the first man to fly solo across the Atlantic, did that because of a prize. It was called the Orteig Prize. It was a $25,000 award that inspired that huge race. Now, in the 1990s, a man named Peter Diamandis formed a foundation called X Prize that was based on Lindbergh's prize and how that incentivized people to try to fly across the Atlantic for some reason. I don't know why that was such a big deal, but it was a big deal, and Lindbergh became a huge hero. And the X Prize are something that he calls incentivized competition. And the goal of the X Prize is to increase investment in a field. So the first one was in 1996. It was only $10 million. And to win that prize, you had to be the first non-government organization to build and fly a vehicle that could carry 3 passengers into space and return them safely and repeat it 2 weeks later. In other words, it had to be a reusable vehicle rather than one of these that crashes into the ocean. And it took a long time. It took actually 8 years for somebody to win it, but somebody won it. Paul Allen was one of them, like he needed the money, right? But the thing is that prize of $10 million spurred an investment of more than $100 million in private spaceflight. So it's had a big payoff. Now, why am I talking about this? Because there's now an X Prize health span. And it's big news. First of all, it's not $10 million, it's $101 million. And there's a bonus prize if you can find something that also cures this disease, this kind of muscular dystrophy called SFHD. And the idea behind it is that there's this barrier in traditional medicine because it focuses on specific diseases. And it does it because those are the easily funded things. When your grandmother dies of cancer, then you want to support cancer research. But really what she died of was aging, but we don't do that. So he thought that this might actually spur a ton of investment in this field. Now, $101 million. Why $101 million? Well, it turns out that Elon Musk has a $100 million cash prize for a carbon removal prize. They wanted to be able to say that this was the largest cash prize ever, so they went out and they raised another $1 million so that they could say that. And I kind of like sticking it to Elon, I must have to say. Now, what do you need to do to win? Well, the grand prize is $20 million is actually just to administer the prize. So here's what you need to do. The winning team must demonstrate that they have some kind of treatment. It can be a drug, it can be a lifestyle intervention, it can be whatever. It can be a combination of them. That what it would do is take a group of people that are aged 65 to 80 and restore the function to the equivalent of 10 or 15 or 20 years younger. And the function that needs to be restored is muscle, cognition, that is brain power, and immune system. And if you do that to equivalent of 10 years younger, then you win $61 million, and 15 years, 71, 20 years, $81 million. Now, is anybody going to enter this? I mean, you know, $81 million is not chicken feed. There's good reason to think. Well, it turns out, yeah, that the entries are now just about closed. This was as of September. I didn't put the latest data in. The latest data, there are 473 teams entered from 54 countries. So there's a lot of people out there that think that they can win this prize. Now, the important thing about the prize is that there are advisors to the prize. There are people who come up with the rules and who wins and all. And you might recognize even some of these advisors. And then there's a team that tells how you should win. Now, I didn't say yet anything about whether the people involved in this can be bribed or not. I'll just put that out there. So I think given all the real science, this incentivized competition, you can imagine with almost 500 entrants, how much research this is going to spur. It has to be done by 2030. The therapy has to have its effect in no more than a year. So it has to be something that's done a year. And there are almost 500 teams that think they can do it. Probably most of them are wrong. By the way, if you feel like entering, the deadline is December 20th, so you're going to have to, you can still enter after that, but the cost goes up. It costs $1,000 to enter if you do it before December 20th. It costs about $100,000 to enter if you wait after that. So I'll stop there. My agent always tells me, you better plug your book at the end or don't come talk to me. And so there's my book and all of my relatives under various pseudonyms. I do have to note my buddy here, Gary Revkin, who 2 days ago got his Nobel Prize. And it was nice of him to give me this blurb. So thanks for your attention. I'm happy to take questions.
So I think we're going to start off with a question from online.
What role does obesity play in this aging gracefully narrative? Since obesity is a major contributing factor to many of the diseases mentioned, how many of the anti-aging benefits of Ozempic are attributable to its efficacy in treating obesity?
Yeah, so just repeating that, the question was about obesity and how important obesity is and whether the Ozempic effects were simply the reduction in obesity. And certainly we know that that's not good healthfully. In fact, for the longest time, the best way we knew to make laboratory animals live longer was to feed them less. Certainly that's a contributor, but it's also clearly not the whole story. There's something else. I made a joke one time. I put it out on what used to be Twitter, which is now X. I said, right after the X Prize was announced, I said, I'm going to win the X Prize. Actually, I'm not eligible since I'm on the teams, but so I'm going to win the X Prize. It's going to be Ozempic plus growth hormone. And the reason I said plus growth hormone is one of the side effects of Ozempic is that you lose muscle as well as fat. And so I thought, well, to contradict that, we'll actually add some growth hormone. It was a joke, but way too many people took it seriously, and it got a whole bunch of responses that too many for me to bother responding to. So.
We'll open up the floor to questions. I think we have our first one.
You mentioned rapamycin for HCM in cats. Do you think that could be a reasonable model of human HCM, or do you think it's too different?
Yeah, I don't see why it wouldn't be. I don't know of any dramatic differences in the disease. So I think it likely will be, and stay tuned. Stay tuned is what I say for a lot of this stuff.
It seems like a lot of the therapies that you discussed really started the therapies in like at an aged time point. Mm-hmm. Would there be benefit of starting those therapies earlier, or do you think that there's a really critical window that, targeting those pathways early is not helpful and you really have to wait until, the person has aged?
Yeah, very good question. So the first way that we knew how to make laboratory animals live longer was, like I say, with this thing called dietary restriction. Feed them 30 or 40%. We know from that the earlier you start it, the bigger the effect. But we don't seem to see that with a lot of these other drugs. With rapamycin, for instance, if you start it instead of 20 months, if you started it at, which is the equivalent of 60, you start at 9 months, which also there was a very tiny difference in how long they live. And it makes a certain amount of sense. If you're trying to prevent things from getting worse, if they haven't yet started to get worse, then maybe you're not having any effect. So maybe it doesn't do anything Until also, when you're 20 years old, you think you're going to live forever anyway. So you're not motivated to do it. By the time you're Jeff Bezos' age, you say, okay, I got $3 billion extra dollars, and so. Yeah.
Given all that you know about aging, what are you personally doing to improve the quality and quantity of your life? So what do you have the most confidence in being effective and safe?
Yeah, I was afraid someone would ask that. Journalists always love to ask me this, so I'll tell you. First of all, I don't do anything. I don't even take multivitamins, so I don't do anything. What I do, I'm kind of a gym rat, so I do a lot of exercise. I try to eat sensibly, and I don't smoke. Basically, I do the things that my mother told me would be good for me. The one thing that we know is really good for improving your health that I'm not so good at is good night's sleep. So I'm not very good at, and most of my friends and academics, the academics is probably not a great lifestyle because I can't tell you the number of times I send somebody an email at 3 a.m. and I get one right back, right? So, but I should do it. So that's what I do. But as soon as the evidence is in, I would take any of these things as soon as there's credible evidence. But I'm an evidence guy. Until you show me the evidence, I'm not going to try it. Even though there's no reason to think that taking Fisetin would have any bad side effects, or metformin at all. It's just that I have this quirk that I want to see evidence before I try something.
Thank you for your talk. I have a two-part question. The first one is, do we really want humans to be living to the age of around 150 years old when, a natural, elegant death is a form of population control? And my second question pertains to appreciating American capitalism. Do you have any worries that, for example, modern medicine and large pharma companies, they don't want to create therapies or cures, they want to develop things to treat signs and symptoms so that ultimately their products can be more of a subscription service, if you will?
Yeah.
Can you touch on both of those topics, please?
Sure. So the first one is an interesting point, and it's a very valid concern. My argument would be that this is something that we have to deal with whether we make people live longer or not. Because the population, we're now over 8 billion. So this is an important issue. We need to figure out how to deal with it. Whether if people live longer, they're going to have more kids, not quite clear, because usually as life expectancy goes up, number of kids goes down. Right now, all the developed countries have fertility rates below replacement. So I think that's a serious problem, but one that we have to deal with regardless of doing it or not. The second one, I bow to no one in my cynicism towards big pharma. But they now have gotten very, very engaged in this. And that's because let's imagine that everybody over the age of 50 is taking a pill daily. How much money could they potentially make out of that? So they're very interested. Now, there's another issue, which is what if these things exist, but they're too expensive for most of us? They're only available, to the Silicon Valley zillionaires. Well, that, again, it's a fair issue. Typically, though, eventually things that start off like this get cheaper and cheaper and broaden out. And if Jeff Bezos lives to be 150, I don't begrudge him that because it doesn't cost me anything. So again, I'm not too worried about that. I think pharma has a profit motive. If they can profit off of making you live longer, they'd be delighted to do it.
I have a question. There are lots of things, pills and everything you can buy out there. And are antioxidants, do they play a role in all of this? And what about claims that are being made for NAD+?
Yeah, so good questions. So antioxidants, the answer is there's no evidence they do anything. except if you take excessive doses of them, they can actually be bad for you. They can also interfere with medical tests. So antioxidants are really not part of what's going on in aging research any longer. NAD plus is very interesting. Now, the interventions testing program tested that in mice, and it didn't have any effect at all. But it's one of these things that from a biochemical viewpoint has a lot of logic behind it. I know of a skin cream, an NAD skin cream that's now being tested in Korea. So I'd say it's too early to know about NAD. It's currently has our interest, just like antioxidants had our interest in the 1980s. That didn't pan out, but maybe NAD is. Certainly at this point, there's no evidence that it's really going to keep you healthy longer. It's just sort of biochemical logic that says, yeah, probably should.
When you talked about threats, you kind of made me think of something that's been in the news a lot lately, and that is AI. How do you see AI affecting the research, and particularly the maybe accelerating some of these tests and where it might go? Yeah,
that's a very interesting question. What about AI? It's one of the big reasons that I think I'm going to win my bet, to tell you the truth. And I'll tell you, so some of these drugs took years and years and years to test to get into human clinical trials. There was a new experimental drug developed in 18 months by AI that's already in human trials. So I think it has the possibility of accelerating things really dramatically.
Steve, thank you for the talk. I think you know that you got several veterinarians in the audience. So my question turns to dogs. And certainly there's limitations in the data set and the data structure with dog aging, with medical records and so forth. But there's broad anecdotal support to the idea that dogs like golden retrievers used to live much longer 50 years ago or so. Anecdotal though it may be, there's at least some concern that even in the advances of veterinary medicine, we're not seeing similar extensions in lifespan in our pets. Here's the difficult part of the question. Can you speculate as to why we may not be seeing similar advances on the veterinary side?
No, that is a really good question. And my thought is that, first of all, I love the dog as a model of human aging, way more than I like rats and mice. And that's because, first of all, they live with us. They don't live in the laboratory. Secondly, they get more of the same spectrum of diseases that we do. It's really interesting to me that there hasn't been an improvement. And I'm just wondering how much of that has to do with how much real veterinary care dogs get, how many preventive visits that they have. There is a large project now, national project called the Dog Aging Project that I'm a very big fan of. And any of you can enroll your dog in it. My dog is number 34,555. And that basically tracks dogs, tracks everything about them, who they live with, what their exercise habits is, what kind of food they're eating. And basically, within 10 years, because dogs age so much quicker, that is going to teach us a tremendous amount. And then there's also a small rapamycin trial as part of that. So look, if you're interested, look up Dog Aging Project. I feel a little bit of a sense of, I don't know, ownership of that, because the person that started it got interested in this project when I convened a workshop on dog health and dog aging, and really said, there's a lot of interesting stuff there. Well, he took that and ran with it and raised all kinds of money. And so this is a really, really going to be a huge contributor, I think, to both dog health, which we care about, right, and human health in the future.
Beautiful.
So with that, I think we're going to close up questions. Thanks for everybody's attendance and great questions and fantastic presentation. So Dr. Austad, we would love to thank you for your research, and as a token of our appreciation of the things you're doing and sharing this with us, we would like to give you this plaque.
Thanks so much. My maternal side of my family actually came from Missouri, so very nice to have this. Yeah, Lathrop, Missouri. It's near. You do? Okay, I don't, but I'd like to. Yeah. So thanks a lot, David. I appreciate it.
And you really shared your research in a way that was accessible, and I think that is something we really, really appreciate. So thank you so much.
Thank you.